feel like people live captured by a machine. They live under the constraints of politics and laws and industry and forces that are far beyond them. Like, we had this really weird experience the other day where we were in San Francisco, and we're standing on a ridge above the ocean, and you can see, as far as the eye can see, that there's ships on the water. And the ships move not under the force of the people that are living on the land in a clear and directed way. It's just the system that operates in the background that all of us are suspended in. And I think that that's a really deeply alienating condition to exist in. And the environmental movement is that in a nutshell. I think that it's people trying to wrestle with their alienation from the systems in which they live and trying to scrabble back a little bit of the power that they believe that they once had. But I don't know that ever since the dawn of agriculture that they've really had that power, because the minute that you stop living in small tribes on the land and instead you are part of a system, right, where there are classes and there are technological duties that you must perform within that structure, you no longer have this ease of just being on the landscape. And it's solved a lot of things, right? It's removed the drudgery of survival, but it has not replaced it with something that is satisfying.
You said that very well. I like that. Or I feel the same way. I haven't used exactly those same words, but I think perhaps our social and mental or intellectual or capacities will not be capable of dealing with the internet age. It's already very clear that it's being used for really nefarious purposes by really nasty actors, and while I admire Elon Musk's character and his honesty, and it pains me that he would actually allow his people to write garbage just because it's his promotional position to do that. And okay, he's a salesman as well as being a brilliant technologist and etc. But and I'm not picking on him, except that he's easy pickings right now, because on one hand he's a hero, and on the other hand he's gaming the system. And so I'm afraid that we may not be able, as a cohesive civilization, to deal with this situation from an information bombardment point of view. And so I try to just stick to the science. And one thing that everybody should know is, and most of the mainstream media didn't even mention it. They told us when the coral reefs were dying. They told us when the Great Barrier Reef was 93% dead. And then they just shut up. And everybody thinks the coral reef is 93% dead. Last summer, the official coral reef people in Australia, the Coral Reef Management Plan or whatever it is, announced that last year the coral cover of the Great Barrier Reef was the highest it's been in the 38 years since they started measuring it. And that is the news. And yet a very fine scientist, trying to remember his name now, but he was at the university, James Cook University in Queensland. He was fired for disagreeing with scientists who were saying the coral reef was dying, right up to their Supreme Court, their High Court. The High Court sided with the university in firing him, even though you're supposed to have freedom of speech in a university. That's the kind of thing that is happening these days around these issues. It's really hard to accept, just like it's hard to accept that golden rice hasn't been adopted by every tropical country in the world when 2 million kids are dying every year from not having it. And the level of disinformation is so high at this time. It is hard to soldier on some days, because everything I put out now is covered with banners saying misinformation, United Nations stuff, and it's just really frustrating. I mean, I've been working at this all my life, and I have a deep understanding of chemistry and biology and biotechnology and all of these things. And I know that people are being unfairly scared about so many of them. And it is the invisible and remoteness of things. Science is based on evidence, and evidence is observed through observation. You have to observe something before you can say it exists. But, God is invisible. The devil is invisible. All kinds of evil things are invisible. And chlorine is kind of invisible. CO2 is clearly invisible. So is radiation and all of the remote things like polar bears and coral reefs and underwater stuff and stuff that's in the jungle. They keep saying that the Amazon is being destroyed. Hardly anybody lives in the Amazon. It's called a human desert because it's not particularly hospitable. So it's hard to deal with that and to figure out how to get around it. So I write books. I do these interviews. I try to explain to people what the real situation is. But the Earth is not dying, and far from it. The CO2 fertilization effect is causing a massive increase. And you can go on the internet and look at NASA's satellite imagery of the Earth showing up to 30% increase in the growth of vegetation, especially in the driest areas, because CO2 not only fertilizes the plant, it also makes it more efficient with water, so that trees can now grow where trees couldn't grow before. Because when the CO2 goes up, the plant doesn't have to open its stomata so often or so wide or have so many of them that it doesn't lose as much water through. That's where the water gets out of the plant. Transpiration. It also has a function in order to pull the nutrients up from the roots. It has to leave some water into the air. But when the CO2 goes up, they're much more efficient in that process. So that's why forests are spreading out onto grasslands in many parts of the world now, not because there's more rain, but because they're using less water. And these are all very positive aspects of CO2, along with the fact that if it wasn't for CO2, there wouldn't be any life on the planet. And when you get down to, only hundreds of parts per million, the plants would like to have optimally at least 800. Now it's 425, at least 800, 1200 is even better. And the proof of this is every commercial greenhouse grower in the world injects CO2 into their greenhouse because they can contain it in there. And that makes the plants much more abundant and they grow faster and they grow bigger, and everybody knows that who's got a greenhouse, but nobody wants to tell anybody about it. Because it disproves the idea. And there's people working in those greenhouses all day and not having any suffering from it.
I mean, I think that it's a proxy for people being afraid that something bad is happening to their civilization, and your hopelessness about the information landscape and what the internet is doing to us, I think, is the seed of that hopelessness.
It's also the reason it's also why we're all here today. Like, everybody who's listening, everybody's here because they're dissatisfied with the standard CNN narratives, and they want to go deeper and talk to people who are outside of the chosen expert space. And that's actually, we're not alone. There's a number of podcasts that are popping up and other journalism forms, documentaries. There's people who are feeding. There's creators who are really just serving to bring people together around these issues. And I think there is a lot of hope there, in that, of course, these major structures have gotten corrupted, but people are starting to kind of realize it too. And that's, I don't think we'd have a podcast if people weren't dissatisfied with the main information channels. And I think there's a lot of some of the most popular podcasts in the world are on that same tick.
And I think that the fight beyond the environmental fight is a fight for ideas. It's a fight for people to be able to think clearly in a landscape where there's a lot of noise. And I think that people inherently want to live alongside healthy ecosystems. They want to go to the beach and they want to see that there's fish and corals and seaweed and not garbage and this weird, greasy, slicked over water.